Welcome to Travels Through Time, the podcast made in partnership with Colograph. Hello, I'm Peter Moore. Today we're up at 10,000 feet to catch the very first glimpse of the Spitfire. The 1920s are often remembered as the Roaring Twenties, an exuberant time when people threw off the inhibitions of the past and gazed towards the future. One event that caught the zeitgeist was the Schneider Trophy, a sort of Formula One race in the air where the best designers and the bravest pilots would see who could push their airboat the fastest. As today's guest, Alasdair Cross, explains, there was something extra special about the Schneider Trophy of 1925. The rise of Benito Mussolini to power in Italy had injected an extra sense of tension, but for the British, all eyes were on the curious new Supermarine S4. Back then, the excitement was all about an innovative plane that was going to smash the 200 mile per hour mark. But looking back today, there is something far more interesting about R.J. Mitchell's Supermarine S4. It was the first look that everyone got of that plane that would become the Spitfire. Alasdair Cross is a radio and television producer and the co-author of the book The Spitfire Kids, the generation who built, supported and flew Britain's most beloved fighter. This week marks 81 years since the beginning of the Battle of Britain, the contest with which the Spitfire will forever be remembered. So this was a perfect opportunity for me to find out a bit more about the origins of a masterpiece of British engineering. I shall begin by welcoming you, Alasdair Cross, to Travels Through Time. This is, I hope, going to be a really fun recording. There's so much we're going to talk about. You've given me some wonderful material to start with, but I think the first point of opening up has to be, of course, with the Spitfire. The best place to start is with the machine itself. It's widely known as a masterpiece of British engineering, and it fought most famously in the Battle of Britain, which started 81 years ago this week, I think, if I've got my maths right. So 400 miles an hour, 8 machine guns, turns on a sixpence. It was too much for the Messerschmitts with its dexterity and its Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. When did it first appeal to you as a piece of engineering?
The first time I saw one, I think, was in the Orkney Islands, where I was brought up. And there was an air show which was occasionally held. It must have been the most northerly air show in Britain and probably the smallest one as well. Somebody at the airport, some guy who ran the airport, had connections with the RAF and with kind of collectors around the country. So we'd get the Red Arrows coming up. We'd have these astonishing old military aircraft from around the world appearing at the tiny little airport in Kirkwall in Orkney. And I got this very faint memory of being absolutely dazzled by a pink Spitfire, a powder pink Spitfire. And when I was writing the book, I was thinking, could that be possible? A pink Spitfire? It just seemed so unlikely. But a little bit of research revealed that some of the later models of the Spitfire that were used for air reconnaissance were actually painted pink on the bottom, because that was apparently harder to spot from the extreme altitude that they'd be getting fired at by the Germans.
Oh, so it was an original feature.
Yeah.
It wasn't something that a kind of whim of someone in 1967 when they thought they'd...
Yeah, I thought it was a slightly
back.
camp collector had kind of designed one themselves, but no, this was a real thing. The pink Spitfire did exist.
Right, well, so I suppose as well, we alluded to it there, there's the actual machine itself and the legend of the operations in the Battle of Britain. I mean, if you look at this history with a very clear eye, how can we appraise the importance of the Spitfire in that particular theatre of war? Was it absolutely fundamental as we've been brought up to believe, or is there a slight element of hype about the story too?
Well, inevitably it's a little bit of both. When you mention you're writing a book on the Spitfire, you immediately get lots of calls and emails saying, But there was more Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain. Yeah, they shot down more German planes, which is absolutely true and undeniable. And the battle couldn't have been won without the Hurricane, I'm sure. But I'm sure it couldn't have been won without the Spitfire either. And the Spitfire, although it shot down less aircraft, it became an icon. And the iconic status was actually really useful during the war. There's a kind of much spread rumour that German pilots would always say they were shot down by a Spitfire rather than by anti-aircraft fire or a Hurricane or something else, because there was a certain kind of element of pride in that, because the reputation of the Spitfire had spread so far and so fast and had frightened Luftwaffe pilots. It almost had more of a role as a kind of propaganda tool than it did actually, shooting down aircraft in 1940.
I can see earlier, because when I was thinking about this interview and this episode, of course, I went back to look at that film, The First of the Few, which the most striking thing about that famous black and white film is that it was shot in, and I should say it's actually called Spitfire, or known as Spitfire in the States, isn't it? Which is worth saying. But that was shot in 1942, so very, very early on. I mean, this is during the war itself, and even before many of the consequential moments of World War II had happened. So if there is a legend to the Spitfire, it was formed very, very early, and you have these actors saying, I can't see a spit in the air without getting a kick out of it. It's designed to give you a shot of adrenaline, isn't it?
That's right. The reputation was forged so early, and even while the Battle of Britain was on, there were film producers in Hollywood and in the sort of British equivalent around London who were kind of casting around for scripts and stories and actors and things to actually produce a Spitfire film as quickly as possible. And films were coming out in 1941 in the States and 42 with The First of the Few. Actually, kind of most of the American ones, in fact, had exactly the same storyline. There were 3 in a row that all had a storyline where there was a slightly arrogant American pilot came over to Britain to help out the Brits during the battle, shot down lots of Germans, and was kind of redeemed by the love of a good woman. That happened every time. And I think British cinema audiences were slightly jaded by these because they kind of knew the truth of what had been going on, so they yearned for a British telling of the story. And The First of the Few was that was Leslie Howard, the very big Hollywood star at the time, British Hollywood star, who just starred in Gone with the Wind, the biggest film of all time. He came back to Britain during the war to help out and make sort of propaganda films, and he was one of those casting around for a Spitfire script. And when he found the story of The First of the Few, which is a story of R.J. Mitchell designing the Spitfire, he leapt on it and starred in it as R.J. himself. And it was a massive hit and went to America and was retitled, very meaningfully retitled, Spitfire, because that was the one aircraft of the war that Americans would have known at that time.
Yeah, and this is obviously taking us directly into the realms of the projects that you've been working on over the last couple of years, which has yielded both a podcast and a book. The Spitfire Kids is the book. It's sitting right in front of me now, but I thought it'd be a really nice opportunity really for you to explain what you were trying to do in that project that was a little bit different to the traditional telling of the Battle of Britain that we're very used to. And I suppose it connects to what we've been saying already, which is this like kind of idea of looking across the different stories which connect to the aeroplane.
Yes. The starting point was really the podcast. The idea of the podcast for the World Service was to look at the whole process of the construction of the Spitfire and how the production was spread out through southern England when the factory in Southampton was bombed. It was an incredible effort of will to move all the machinery and all the workers out to very small country towns around southern England to actually build the Spitfire bit by bit in tiny workshops and glove factories and car showrooms all around southern England, which was an incredible story in itself. But as I was making that, and we were kind of collecting diaries and memoirs and old archive interviews from the time together to make the radio series, it struck me that the people's voices we're hearing were incredibly young. There's a sort of famous statistic about the average age of pilots in the Battle of Britain being 20, I think. But we were reading these diaries from people who are 17, 16, 15, 14 even. Kids who would now be sort of preparing for their GCSEs were building Spitfires. And I was just astonished by how they must have felt. The idea of suddenly being on the front line of a war at 14, when you're an apprentice or in your first office job or whatever. I just want to get inside their heads, really, just think, how scared were you? How surprised were you to be in this incredible historical position? And that was kind of the starting point of the book, really, was just get inside the heads of these teenagers and what they were thinking. We were free to go back to the interviews of the time, of their personal diaries, which they took, which they wrote at the time. And through those, you actually see beyond the sort of stereotype of the stiff upper lips and the kind of bravery in the face of fascism, and you actually get inside these kids and what they were feeling. And they wrote, they would write about their fear and about how in the Southampton factory, for example, they were ordered to stop sounding the air raid alarms when aircraft were spotted, because it was happening so often that production was getting disrupted and not enough Spitfires are getting built. So the air raid siren was only allowed to be sounded if there was an aircraft actually over the factory, basically dropping a bomb on it, which was obviously far too late to save yourself. And these people knew they were on the front line. They knew that the German airfields were 30-minute flight away on the coast of France, and they could be bombed at any time. And they knew the factory would be destroyed eventually, and they were absolute prime targets.
But I will go back to the film which I was talking about just a moment ago, the first of the few, because there's a really nice scene in that kind of fits with what we're going to try and do now. Because you can imagine the scene of an airfield somewhere in the south of Britain, and they're watching the Spitfires come back after a dogfight in the sky, and the pilots are talking between themselves, and one of them says, "I hear that the Spitfire was invented in 2 hours by someone at their golf club," and then it cuts away to somebody else who said, "Oh no, the story is much more grave. A whole host of things had to happen before that miracle before us came to life." And I just thought that was a wonderful, wonderful kind of setup for what we're going to try and do today, which is go backwards beyond 1940, which of course is the history that lots of people do know, to chase the deeper roots of the Spitfire. And to do so, we're going to have to ask you the question that we ask everyone who comes on the podcast, which is, Alasdair Cross, if you could travel back through time, what year would you like to visit?
I would like to visit 1925, Peter.
Well, there we go. 1925 isn't a year that we visited before, but slap bang in the middle of the roaring 20s. It's a time which isn't that far away, but I don't know, it seems worth exploring.
As you mentioned, the roaring 20s, it's got these sort of connotations of incredible glamour. The First World War was in the past. There was a lot of wealth around. There was new music. There was new dances. There was just excitement in the air, and that's what the appeal of the time is, really. And a race for speed as well. This is when world land speed records were getting broken and world airspeed records were getting broken, as we'll go on to talk about. So there's this kind of desperation for a new world, something new and exciting, and socially, spiritually, and kind of physically as well. And you can see that in the development of engineering and, as I say, music and culture as well. So there's just so much going on to kind of get your teeth into it. And the birth of the Spitfire happens right at this point as well, which is why we want to talk about this year.
Brilliant. Yeah, I suppose it's before the Wall Street crash, which happens a bit later on, and it's also before that I don't know, that kind of really important moment when Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic Ocean. That was 27, I think. It's a bit later on. So I don't know, where are we in the story, in a broad sense? Where are we in the story of air travel at this point, or is it's still a very new thing, isn't it?
Yeah, one of the most exciting aspects of this year and this period, was something called the Schneider Trophy, which was a race to build the fastest aircraft in the world. And strangely enough, at the time, the fastest aircraft meant seaplanes, because airports were very much in their infancy. And the feeling was that people would travel from city to city by seaplanes, because most of the great cities of the world, were on rivers or by the ocean. So it was an obvious way to do it without building kind of airport infrastructure. And a chap called Jacques Schneider, a French industrialist, introduced this prize actually in 1913, actually before the First World War. Partly because he felt aviation was developing quite slowly. So obviously the Wright brothers had come up with the Wright Flyer, going at whatever it was, 20 miles an hour. And development had happened quite slowly up to that point. Obviously, in the First World War, development sped up a lot. But again, it slowed down after the war because nobody had any money, and aircraft had proven themselves in a military capability, but people couldn't afford to fly. You couldn't build planes that were big enough to carry enough passengers to be economical. So things were happening quite slowly. But gradually, this kind of level of competition between particularly France, Britain, the US, and Italy built up around this Schneider Trophy, and engineering teams and military teams in each country struggled to build something better and faster that each year could race against the others and win this coveted prize.
One thing I was because this Schneider Trophy is obviously it's something of its time, isn't it? It was kind of over a 20-year period or so. Could you just explain, I suppose, quite briefly, because I think we might be going to that later on, so we can talk about it more then. But how did this race play out? Because of course you can't have a circuit in the air, like a Formula One circuit or something like this, but there had to be some measure of control over the participants. So how did they actually compete? How did the race go forward?
The Schneider Trophy was done as a sort of time trial, so each aircraft would take off and go around a circuit, and the circuit was chosen by the winner of the previous year's trophy. So if it was Italy, then the Bay of Naples was sometimes chosen. If it was Britain that had won it, then they would do it around the Isle of Wight and the Solent estuary, and there'd be a sort of timed circuit, and each aircraft would do that.
Let's get into the format now of the time travel and ask you where you would like to go in 1925 for your first of your three scenes, please.
Well, I think we should start in Rome, which is always a nice place to start.
Perfect.
Because on the 3rd of January 1925, Benito Mussolini gave a speech to the Chamber of Deputies, the parliament effectively, in which he took complete control of Italy. He became the dictator. He had been in power by democratic and semi-democratic means for a few years at that point, and he'd been kind of gradually running down the democratic institutions and cementing his hold on power. But some of his supporters in the fascist party thought he was going too slowly, and they assassinated a socialist leader and basically pushed Mussolini into acting more quickly. And he gave a speech to the Chamber of Deputies in which he said, "I and I alone assume the political and historical responsibility for all that has happened." And that was him saying, "Yep, I killed a socialist leader, and tough. I'm in charge now. I'm the dictator. If you want to get rid of me, you're gonna have to fight me." So that was the start of the Mussolini dictatorship, effectively.
And it seems natural as a beginning point for the age of the dictators, which follows, because of course Hitler at this point was a long way away from the chancellorship of Germany. So Mussolini is, of course, far before him. But does this, I suppose, in the UK, which is our primary focus with the Spitfire, is this taken as a unnerving political development already?
I mean, it certainly is. People are watching it, but there's a lot of admiration for Mussolini, as I'm sure most people know. The trains ran on time, famously, and his pushing of the kind of engineering and stylistic elements of Italian society really attracted people as well. The Italian engineering went on leaps and bounds, and that fed into the Schneider Trophy competition. Mussolini himself was very much intent on winning this trophy because it proved that Italian engineers were the best, and at the time they probably were. So there was this obviously incredibly negative connotations as well, but there were positive aspects of this sort of style of Mussolini that were attractive to people in Britain as well.
Can you describe the kind of aeroplane that was competing in the Schneider Trophy or was expected to? Maybe that's the better way of posing this question. That was expected to be entered into the 1925 Schneider Trophy, because you say the Italians at this point were probably the strongest nation, and I know they'd won several years before, and then you have this political development which kind of adds this nationalistic aspect to the story. If we were to imagine a kind of machine they were to enter, is something like a biplane of the Sopwith Camel kind of type about right, or had things moved on since then?
They hadn't moved on enormously. There were two basic types that were competing here. Both would have been biplanes. You had what was a flying boat, so effectively a single hull like a boat, with wings and an engine stuck on the top of it. And the Italians were using that and getting more and more powerful engines, which is why they were very successful. For 1925, though, the Americans had come up with something a little bit different, which was biplanes with floats. So they're a bit more elegant looking. So it looked like a very smooth, streamlined version of a Sopwith Camel with a couple of floats on the bottom, and they were the kind of the peak of the time as we went into the 1925 competition.
I tell you what, let's move on, because I think there's a really nice development that you'd like to go to next. So if we leave Mussolini in the Chamber of Deputies in Rome, having started off there, where would you like to go to next in 1925, please?
Well, my next date is 10th of March, 1925, and we'll go to Southampton, which is the birthplace of the Spitfire. Because this is where the Supermarine Company was set up, and it was the date that the Southampton flying boat was flown for the first time. Now, this is a completely forgotten aircraft. Nobody's interested in it. Nobody's going to write a book about the Southampton. But it's absolutely crucial because it was the moment that R.J. Mitchell, who would be the designer of the Spitfire, made his name, made a commercial aircraft that made money and guaranteed the survival of Supermarine as a company, which then allowed him and the company to go on to build a Spitfire and, win the Battle of Britain, really.
So there's so much for us to unpick here. I don't know whether to start with the machine itself or with R.J. Mitchell, the designer. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Southampton?
It's very much a product of its time. So in 1925, the British government had no money, but it had an absolutely enormous empire to try and keep hold of. And there were rebellions breaking out all over the place. There was a famous one in Mesopotamia where it required 100,000 soldiers to hold back a Sunni Shia militia who'd combined together to fight the British. And the thought was, there's got to be an easier way of doing this. And in that particular war, bombers were the answer. They bombed the hell out of a few villages and the tribes surrendered, not surprisingly, after lots of civilian deaths. Very familiar kind of Iraqi story, I think. And there were revolts happening in Egypt as well, and rebellions all over the place. And there's a feeling that you couldn't keep up the standing army moving from place to place to put down rebellions. So what you needed were aircraft that could fly a long way, land easily, be used for ferrying officials and military people around, and potentially for bombing as well. And R.J. Mitchell Reg Mitchell was born in Stoke-on-Trent and worked in railway engineering for a while before he got a job with Supermarine in Southampton. It's a very young, rather eccentric little company on the south coast. And they had built one or two aircraft for the First World War, but it specialised in seaplanes. Because they were on the coast, and the man who ran the company was slightly obsessed by them. So R.J. Mitchell had been kind of improving some of their seaplanes and gradually developing them, and the Southampton was his first real effort at building a full-size model. And the Air Ministry had actually commissioned some airships to fly on a route to Cairo to sort of connect the empire together, and that had been a disaster. So when they saw that R.J. Mitchell was planning this much more efficient aircraft, they actually bought a bunch of these aircraft off plan before they'd even been tested, which was an incredible show of confidence in Mitchell as a designer and in the company to build them. And that kind of caught fire, and other air forces and companies around the world put in orders for the aircraft as well. So it gave this company such an amazing chance to kind of build up its prosperity and its confidence.
I mean, Mitchell himself, let's talk about him, because he seems, well, you talk about the Spitfire Kids later on, these very young people. Actually, Mitchell in 1925 is only 29 years old, I think. He's been the chief designer for 6 years, so he was appointed at just 24 years old. You describe him as being stubborn, temperamental. He's got this quite strange sense of humour, but he's probably the finest aircraft designer in the country at this point. Is that a fair point?
I think so, yeah. I mean, there's a whole sort of generation of them at various small companies around the country, because a generation had been inspired by seeing the Wright Flyer and the exploits of the aces in the First World War. So it was a very young industry, a very young engineers. So all the big names were kind of in their 20s. And Mitchell was definitely perceived as being the one to watch, because he was willing to try things out that were a little bit different and a little bit risky. And because he was employed at this very eccentric company, he became chief designer there at 24, which seems absurd. He had so much scope to do what he wanted in this small company.
Well, you picked the 10th of March in Southampton at the Supermarine factory. Supermarine, probably we should say a word or two about them, because you also describe that as an odd company, and an odd, quite small company in a way, which itself is only 10 years old or so, and kind of founded by this person who's a blend of an aviator, an inventor, and a politician, which seems really eccentric to us, I suppose, as well. It's down in Southampton on the south coast of England, with plenty of water nearby, so they can test out their new models. But this moment on the 10th of March is important, isn't it? When the flying boat is kind of debuted, or it goes out into public for the very first time. Is it a successful flight?
It certainly is. It certainly is, and it's watched by important people, and it repays the trust, I suppose, that the Air Ministry has put in the company. If anything had gone wrong with that, then the company would have been finished. So the fact that Mitchell was able to put purely his design into the air, show it worked, and in front of important officials, meant that Supermarine were guaranteed a future, and with their future was the Spitfire.
Wow. So let's talk about the engineering aspect of this a little bit. What was different about this this kind of plane? I'm still searching for the right vocabulary, because I know at the time the words were a bit amorphous as well. But what had changed between what we were just describing just a moment ago, these old biplanes, and this particular model?
Well, this was a very sort of tough and practical aircraft. It had to be able to fly a long way. It could fly 500 miles on a single tank of fuel, and it could refuel in heavy seas from a ship. So it could reach corners of the Empire that nothing else could before. But it was also sort of well armed, so it could protect itself. And it was actually quite comfortable as well. It was one of the first aircraft, I think, to have a toilet for the crew, so they could keep flying without stopping. And there were hammocks in it as well, so they could sleep in it. So the idea was you could fly lots of these aircraft, to a spot in the Empire where there was trouble going on, bomb the natives, fly back, all without any trouble whatsoever. And they proved it. It was a kind of very modern marketing technique. They flew, I think, 20 of these aircraft around the British Isles in a 10,000 mile circuit in, I think, 20 days, something like that, to prove that just how reliable this plane was.
I wonder if any of them got up to Orkney. That's maybe a good thing for you to ponder. But it
yes,
is,
I don't know.
exactly. But at the same time, it is worth stressing this idea of the flying boat being a slightly different thing to what we think about and know so well today. The things that actually fly over my head every 120 seconds in West London. This I don't know. It's almost quite romantic, this picture of the airports not existing, but air travel being kind of entwined with the nature and the geography of a city. So, you just come in and land on the Thames and then get ferried off. And if you were going to New York, you'd land in the Hudson or something like that. It's I suppose it's a logical thought, and that's exactly how this was working. And I suppose why Southampton was a good place to have a factory and a business like Supermarine. Is that right?
Absolutely, because you had the maritime expertise there. In fact, right next to the Supermarine factory, there was the John Thornycroft shipbuilders, who were the absolute cutting edge shipbuilders in the country, probably in Europe at the time. So expertise could kind of swap across the fence, basically.
Yeah, and as well, you have to make the obvious connection with the great ship launches. Must have been a familiar part of the seascape in Southampton. So, I mean, wasn't Titanic from there as well? I know she was from Belfast at some point, but she set sail from Southampton. So there's a kind of dovetailing of two different histories, the maritime history and the aeronautical history here, isn't there?
Yes, and you get a real sensation, even now, if you go down to Southampton. The original slipway of the Supermarine factory is still there. So they built the slipway before they built the factory, I think, because they knew it was going to be seaplanes they were predominantly building there, or they thought that was what was going to happen. And you can look out from there to see the docks where, as you say, there's the Queen Mary and the QE2 and the Titanic would have sailed from. So the whole city kind of gathers around this kind of nautical theme, and the aircraft were an integral part of that. And it's one of the reasons why Southampton was such a kind of cutting edge place at the time in the run up to the war, because technology and new ideas was kind of coming in from all sides there, from all across the empire and the developing world. So it was a fascinating place to be in the 20s and 30s.
Well, of all the people that would have been there, we'll just concentrate a little bit more on R.J. Mitchell for a second, because I'm really fascinated by him as just a biographical character, really. Is he someone, through the research and the writing of the book, that I suppose you came to know him well? Would you have liked to work with him? Was he a great tyrant in the office, or was he a bon vivant who could take people with him? Because these pioneers, these engineering pioneers, often have kind of equally outlandish personalities. So do you want to say anything about him and what he was like?
Yeah, I mean, you certainly don't come away liking him as a man. He's everyone who writes about him and everyone who was interviewed about him, in the immediate aftermath of the war, talks about his temper. He had an incredibly short temper. Now, a lot of people put that down to the fact that he had bowel cancer in the last few years of his life and was basically in pain the whole time. So it's not entirely surprising he had a very short temper. But reading a little bit deeper, that seems to have been there right from the start. But he was also an incredible collaborator, which was crucial in the Spitfire story. He would, when he was considering an idea, when he was looking at a component or how something would work on an aircraft, he would call his team together, and they were all very young. They were all late teens, early 20s. He would gather them together and talk through the idea, and he would listen to everybody's idea. And if it was a stupid idea, he'd shout them down, and they wouldn't get another word in edgeways. But if it was a good idea, he would take it on board, and it would become part of the aircraft. And that was really vital, because he died so young. He saw the Spitfire fly, but he died well before it was in combat. And that was so important during the war, because he'd built up this team of young people, because they were able to develop the aircraft as the Germans developed their Messerschmitt and brought in the Focke-Wulf and other new fighters. The Spitfire could keep up because this team knew the aircraft in great depth and were able to collaborate and come up with new ideas to make it faster and stronger in the competition in the Second World War.
If we were to look at the Southampton, maybe we can try and find I don't know, is there much imagery of it that survives? I don't know. You might be able to say, but would there be anything recognisably Spitfire-ish about it, or is that all to come in the future at this point?
There's absolutely nothing in the Southampton that you could associate with a Spitfire. You would look at that aircraft and think it was almost the exact opposite of a Spitfire, which is why what comes next is such a surprise and such an astonishing revolution. Because
R.J. Mitchell's hard at work. Brilliant. Well, that's the perfect setup for the third of your 3 scenes.
Hello, it's Artemis. At Travels Through Time, we're incredibly proud to be partnering with Jordan Lloyd and Colourgraph. Jordan is one of the world's leading visual historians. Through his excellent craftsmanship, he brings black and white photographs of the past to life in startling colour and clarity. Jordan's extraordinary work, as well as that of his contemporaries, can be found on the website colourgraph.co. At colourgraph.co, you'll be able to explore the process and history behind the colorization work, but most excitingly of all, you can also buy some of these beautiful photographs as museum-grade fine art prints. They make an unusual and striking present for that friend or family member of yours who loves the past, and they're an excellent addition to any room. Whether it's a colorized photograph of the US Capitol building from 1846, or a candid shot of the Beatles from 1964, you're pretty sure to find something that enchants you. I know I certainly have many times. It's hard to explain really over audio just how cool these prints are, so I encourage you to have a look for yourself at colourgraph.co. What's more, Travels Through Time listeners get 10% off when they enter the code TTT at the checkout.
Where would you like to go to next, please?
Okay, we're going to be a slightly more glamorous location. We're going to move to Baltimore on the 23rd of October, 1925.
Right. So what's happening in Baltimore then?
So this is the 1925 Schneider Trophy. And from a British perspective, there's more excitement than there has ever been before, because R.J. Mitchell has had the time and the money, which the success of the Southampton flying boat has helped with. He's had the time and the money to design an all-new aircraft, a complete revolution in aircraft, basically, to compete in the Schneider Trophy and win it back for Britain. So what he's come up with is something called the Supermarine S4, and it is stunning. It's one of the most beautiful aircraft you'll ever see. It's a kind of silver dart set on top of 2 enormous floats, and it basically looks like a mini Spitfire. If you took chopped the floats off it, it looks exactly like a Spitfire. So this is a monoplane. It's got the engine integrated into the fuselage. It's made of steel tubing. This is completely different from anything that's come before in the Schneider Trophy. Nobody's ever seen anything like this before. And he's also got rid of all the monoplanes did exist. There were some in the First World War. But you required lots of sort of wires and struts and things to keep the wings stable. He did away with all of that. So you've just got this incredibly smooth creation. I mean, it looks like something out of Flash Gordon, basically. If you remember the sort of Flash Gordon films, either of the 30s or the 80s, it looks like it's landed from another planet. You know, anybody who'd looked at aircraft before, from the Wright Flyer on to the creations of the 1920s, you would never have seen anything like this. It was a complete revolution.
So we're talking essentially about a paradigm shift almost in engineering, or a new era for air travel. And this all happens in this interval between, the moment in March when we're looking at, the Southampton in Southampton, and we're looking at the S4 in Baltimore. But of course, it probably is more complicated than that. Is this a project and a vision that Mitchell has had for years, and he's just managed to realize it now?
No, it was done very quickly. I think the creation of the Southampton would have been happening a year or two before. It's maiden flight, obviously. So they weren't being designed in parallel as such. Once the Southampton was kind of ready to go, he moved on to this S4 plan, and it seems to have come from nowhere. He just seems to have had this vision. He knew that to win the Schneider Trophy back for Britain, he was going to have to come up with something different, because the Americans had developed this very fast biplane. It was very efficient. It looked good. It was flown by military pilots. It was the one to beat. So he knew he was going to have to come up with a design that was completely different. So this freed him up really to just try the most extreme version of his ideas he could possibly come up with.
Yeah, it seems to have been received with great enthusiasm as well. You've got a quote in the book from Flight Magazine, and they say, one may describe the Supermarine Napier S4, Napier being the engine maker, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
As having been designed in an inspired moment. that the design is bold, no one will deny, and the greatest credit is due to R.J. Mitchell for his courage in striking out on entirely new lines. It's a nice quote, that, which captures, I suppose, a little bit of the sense of admiration and astonishment and progress which we associate with this moment. And I suppose the biggest question which everyone had was, is it going to fly? Was it kind of just a looker, or was it going to be actually practically useful? So do you want to tell us a little bit about what happened on that day?
Yes, before that day, it had the first few flights had been a little tricky. The Supermarine test pilot, a chap called Henri Biard, who was a bit of a character himself and had won a previous Schneider Trophy, he found it very hard to see out of. The visibility was terrible, and I think on taking off he nearly crashed into a liner. On landing he nearly crashed into a dredger. So he was very critical of that side of it. But once it was in the air, he thought it was gorgeous, and they managed to break the world speed record almost instantly, reaching I think 226 miles an hour, which was pretty astonishing for the time. So
yeah, just to quantify that, I think previously I had a look, it was something like 170 miles an hour. So you're going up enormously just with this one design change.
Yeah, and you think, the Wright Flyer 20 years previously was 20 miles an hour.
Exactly.
So things were moving. Things were starting to move really fast in every sense. In every sense here. But because it had the success and the speed, by the time it was loaded onto a liner to head over to the States for the Schneider Trophy competition, everyone was talking about it. It was the talk of the aviation world and beyond, really.
So, I mean, Biard, Henri Biard, I think I'm pronouncing that right. As you said, he's a great character in himself, and there's a wonderful bit in your book about a previous race where he gets a bit carried away and starts looping the loop and has a bottle of brandy in his pocket and so on, which makes him wonderfully endearing, if not probably the most trustworthy of pilots you'd want. But he seems to do pretty well. Do you want to tell us how Biard goes that day in the new S4?
Yes, so they arrive in Baltimore and set up camp, and things sort of start going wrong right from the start. A tent pole collapses on the plane and damages the tail, and they have to fix that. And the weather's awful, and they have real trouble doing any test flights. But finally, weather clears. They get a chance to go up against some of the other aircraft for a first test flight. There's British and American aircraft flying at the same time. BR takes off, and the spectators on the ground think he's doing some stunts because he kind of flies back over the pier at a strange angle, and they're applauding him because it looks like he's showing off as he had a tendency to do anyway. Takes the plane out to sea, and the plane seems to stop in the air, spirals into the sea, and hits the Atlantic Ocean with an incredible crash. Everyone assumes he's dead, because how could you possibly survive something like that? And
R.J. Mitchell's actually witnessing this, isn't he? He's travelled over with the rest of the Supermarine team, hasn't he?
He is, and there's a terrific photo of them on the liner together. Biard looks sort of relaxed. They're all in tweed suits and ties, obviously, on these deck chairs on the liner, and Biard looks kind of relaxed and ready for anything. But R.J. Mitchell stares at the camera with this kind of fixed glare, and it's terrible to read things into somebody's look from a photo, but he knows Biard's life is in his hands, because he's built this thing that is built for speed and nothing else. Safety is not even a part of the consideration. So he's tense. He's incredibly tense, and always is at these moments. And he watches the plane fall into the sea. He thinks he's killed one of his best friends. Hops into a sort of high-speed launch to go out to the crash site, and the launch breaks down. So he has to go back to the shore, get another boat, head out. And all this time, Biard is underneath this crashed aircraft, desperately fighting his way out, and manages to do it. He actually manages to get himself out of the aircraft, back up on into the air, and it's freezing. He's absolutely freezing. By the time Mitchell and the boat reach him, he's broken some ribs. He's got hypothermia, and he's basically furious with Mitchell. It's taken him so long to get there. But I mean, this is such a key moment in history.
Oh, absolutely. And so, I mean, in so many ways, it's so vivid as an anecdote in itself if it was contained just to, an accident at an air show or an air race. But when you consider the wider significance of the first kind of competition entry for an aeroplane that would go on to become the Spitfire, it's quite a beginning, isn't it?
It certainly is. And that could be the end of the story. And in some ways, it perhaps should have been the end of the story. Why would you let somebody who'd built that aircraft build another one? Because obviously there was no kind of diagnostic reports or anything at the time.
Yeah.
Nobody really knew what had happened. I think the accident report just said it had stalled. Beard thought it was due to wing flutter, which you get in all aircraft. Biplanes are less prone to it. So building a monoplane, you get more flutter. And perhaps because Mitchell had done away with all these wires and struts that hold the wings stable, all to get a more kind of aerodynamic shape, that may have caused more wing flutter than you would normally get, and that might have been what took the plane
so
down.
He just he may well have lost control in that scenario.
Yeah, exactly. The wings would have basically flapped around more than he could possibly control, and it just took him down.
It's certainly a fascinating being. You say this should have been. I don't know whether to linger on the scene for a moment because it is quite. It's almost comic in a way, isn't it? Now that we know that there hasn't been a fatality, you can see these two friends who, in this quite ludicrous situation, and this is almost the Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines moment where you have to go and fish your friend out of the Chesapeake after having seen him crash. I mean, that must have been enormously a charged moment, but it isn't the end of the story for the machine. And maybe this tells us a little bit more about Mitchell as well, because he's persistent, isn't he, in his belief in the value of this and the safety of it.
He is. He's absolutely sure he's onto the right thing with this monoplane design, and he persists with it, and he knows he can get it right. So he basically builds something called the S5, which is very similar, but it's an all-metal fuselage, and he brings back some of the wires and struts to sort of stabilize things. And that is entered for the 1927 Schneider Trophy and wins easily. This is the one that's held in Venice with Mussolini in attendance, ready to kind of welcome another Italian victory. But the British pilot wins very easily, partly because by this time the British government have put some money in and have supplied the pilots. So there's something called the RAF High Speed Flight, which is a group of specialist pilots who are being trained to fly the most high-powered aircraft. So they're perhaps better equipped than Henri Biard, who was a bit of an amateur, to fly these incredibly powerful beasts. And sure enough, they win the competition and bring the trophy back to Southampton.
At what point, I suppose, is 1925 too early for us to start thinking, to think in these nationalistic terms? I know we started off in Italy with Mussolini's ascent and him claiming total power. Is at that point, you think, a motive for the production for people like Mitchell? Is it just mere rivalry, or is there a kind of general acceptance that if there's going to be another conflict, that air conflict, or that kind of control of the air, is going to be fundamental to the victory?
There certainly is, because at this point in history, there's a belief that the bomber will always get through. There's a belief that the bomber is the future of conflict, and that if you've got the biggest bomber fleet and you start a war with somebody, you send your bombers over, you flatten their cities, they surrender. That's the end of it. That's a very common view in military circles and political circles at the time. So there's just a few people in each of the countries who think, actually, you can build a plane that's fast enough, a fighter plane that's fast enough to get to these bombers and shoot them down. And some people are promoting this idea. So the idea of a very fast fighter to defend your country is quite a powerful motive, and certainly part of the Schneider Trophy story.
Mm. Well, I have to say, actually, on reflection, of all the scenes that we've talked about throughout the course of this podcast, and we've done episode after episode now, I quite fancy going along to the Schneider Trophy. I mean, it seems like a very strange spectator sport, which is very, very of its time as well. And they did have lots of people turning out to watch these, didn't they? Did you? I don't know if you've got a number, but there was certainly thousands of people would crowd in to watch, almost like a Formula One race today. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I think 1931 was held on the Solent, and there's an estimate that there's something like 500,000 people crowded onto beaches around Bournemouth and Southampton. And the popular papers really picked up on it. You know, there was prizes for air races and things at the time from the Daily Mail and the Daily Express, and they were quite obsessed by it, by the Schneider Trophy actually.
Wow.
There's a kind of crucial moment which comes a little later in 1931. So the Great Depression's in full flow by this time, and the Labour government think it's absurd to spend money on training up pilots for this race, and they take away the funding. And somebody called Lady Lucy Houston, who is a millionairess and rabid anti-communist, she basically believes that the Labour government are communist stooges. And she's furious that Britain is not going to defend herself by building these fast aircraft. So she actually offers £100,000 to the government to sort of embarrass them into helping out. And there's not much they can do about it. They're phenomenally embarrassed by this offer. So they have to support the 1931 race again. And sure enough, Mitchell builds another aircraft which wins.
Yeah, and then was it 3 in a row and you kept the trophy or something? It was something like that, didn't it?
That's right. So 1931 was Mitchell's third in a row victory, and sure enough, Britain kept the Schneider Trophy, and
I do believe it's
never raced again.
I think it's somewhere in one of the museums down. I'm not sure which of the museums, the Science Museum maybe, somewhere like that. I think I'll have to check it out. But it's I suppose the thing is they're going fast, these planes, but not so fast that you couldn't follow them through the sky. So it would be a tremendous thing to watch, and it's just so exciting to think that you would, in 1925, if you were there in Baltimore on that occasion, you'd witness a crash, of course, but you'd also witness the very, very beginning of the Spitfire story. And you said before that it was recognisably something that would become a Spitfire. Is that right? Yes.
Yes, absolutely. If you kind of cut the floats off the aircraft, it would look like a small Spitfire. It's very similar in style.
Do they exist now, or are they all disappeared from museums? I mean, were many made of the S4?
No, it was just one or two of each model, and okay. there is one in the Solent Sky Museum in Southampton have a model.
So that's where you're going to have to go if you're going to have a look at them. Well, brilliant. Listen, this has been remarkably informative and good fun. There's a few questions I've got left before I let you go, though. First of all, you might need a moment to think about this, but take your time. It's always a fun one. A bit of material history. If you could reach your hand out as we were going through these 3 scenes today and bring some tangible memento back to have with you as a reminder of 1925, is there anything you would like? An object?
I think I would like Henri Biard's flannel suit. He was a very old school character who, even in the heat of the Bay of Naples in summer, would wear a thick flannel suit to fly in, and along with his bottle of brandy that he had with him as well. Yeah. And it just, for me, sums up the kind of eccentric aviation characters of the time.
Oh, that would be brilliant. You can imagine it having a slight alcoholic whiff and a bit of petrol mixed in as well. A bit of a pungent smell. And maybe if you did wear it at work, it kind of might speed everything up. You might be more productive if you were sat at your desk wearing that. So that's a thought. Well, listen. Last of all, I've just got to kind of invite you to say a little bit more about the book or the podcast. I imagine it's just been an immensely enjoyable project to work on, because that's the feeling I get, because the Spitfire is something that we're all familiar with at one level, but there's so much that I learned from reading and listening that is kind of equally as rich as the iconography, if you like. Would you like to say anything more?
Yes, well, it's the astonishing characters you find when you dig into a subject like this. You may know the basic history, you know the story of the Battle of Britain, and some of the famous flyers like Douglas Bader and people like that. But when you dig a little bit deeper, you find characters who are even more fascinating and even braver, and are put under such incredible pressure and tension to produce their moments of bravery that kind of affect history. And finding those people and sort of telling their stories that haven't been given a wide audience before is really an inspiring thing to be able to do.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Good luck with the book, and I recommend heartily the Spitfire Kids to you all. Thank you very much, Alasdair Cross, for coming on Travels Through Time.
Thanks so much, Peter. It's been great fun.
That was me, Peter Moore, talking to Alasdair Cross about the genesis of the Spitfire at the Schneider Trophy in 1925. Alasdair's co-authored book delves into all of this history in captivating detail. It's called The Spitfire Kids, the generation who built, supported and flew Britain's most beloved fighter. To see some photographs of the S4 and the Southampton, two of R.J. Mitchell's designs that were mentioned in today's episode, do head to our website, which is tttpodcast.com. Otherwise, that's it from me today. We'll be back with more next week. Till then, goodbye.